Sorry, but this section is for invited VIPs only. The words rang out like a verdict. Two suited security guards stood rigidly in front of her, arms folded, faces firm with authority. Their voices weren't loud, but the message carried, and heads turned. The crowd murmured, their gazes skimming over her plain, military-style khaki jacket, the faded patches at the shoulders, and the regulation boots. It wasn't a dress, it wasn't silk, and it certainly wasn't what the other mothers were wearing at this prestigious high school's graduation ceremony. June Maddox didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't protest. She merely looked toward the stage, eyes sweeping over the rows of seats, scanning for her son. Ethan. 17, tall, mixed race, and brilliant. His name was carved into the program as valedictorian. He had earned this. And she had earned the right to witness it. But as the guards gestured again, a polite suggestion masking a deeper intention, June slowly stood. Not because she accepted their judgment, but because she understood how this place worked. Not her place, not her people, not her rules. If you've ever been turned away, not for what you've done, but for who you are or who they believe you are, then you know this moment. You've lived it. And if not, stay, because in about 10 minutes, this very stage, this very crowd, and these very guards will be standing in stunned silence. It wouldn't be June who needed saving, but someone would definitely need rescuing. The folding chair had her name taped neatly across the back, Maddox. She arrived early, quietly, slipping past the murmuring crowd that already began clustering around the campus's front lawn. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows beneath a white canopy, the type rented for dignified events and donor galas. June took her seat in the fourth row, marked just behind the main row where school board members and sponsors sat. She nodded politely to the usher, folded her hands over her lap, and breathed in slowly. She wore a faded khaki jacket, standard issue, years old, with one barely visible name patch reading Maddox above the left pocket. Her boots were shined but worn at the soles. Her hair was pinned back tightly, exposing the sharp lines of her face that spoke not of privilege but persistence. It didn't take long. Less than 10 minutes after she had settled in, Mrs. Bellamy arrived. Draped in a coral designer wrap, oversized sunglasses perched atop her perfect blonde waves, she walked as though the ground had been prepared just for her heels. Her husband followed 2 paces behind, carrying her seat cushion and monogrammed fan. She caught sight of June and sniffed, once, as though someone had forgotten to remove an unpleasant centerpiece. Leaning toward another mother in a flowing floral maxi dress, she whispered just loudly enough for 3 rows to hear, "I thought we were keeping the photo section clear of clutter." The chain reaction was subtle but swift. Principal Kent, positioned near the podium, received a note from a staff member. It was short, scribbled in haste. He frowned slightly, scanned the rows, then nodded. Security was dispatched within 5 minutes. They did not rush. They did not cause a scene. That was the skill of men trained in optics. Quiet, intervention, masked as courtesy. "Ma'am," the first guard said, with a practiced, neutral tone, "would you mind stepping aside? We may need to make space for some last-minute arrangements." June looked up calmly. "This is my seat," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My son is the valedictorian." "Yes, ma'am," the second guard nodded. "It's just a temporary adjustment. We'll be sure you still have a great view." June's fingers tightened slightly on the folded program in her lap. She rose without protest because she knew the game. This town had taught her the rules long ago. She didn't raise her voice or demand validation. She simply gathered her things and followed them, heels clicking against the walkway. They didn't lead her far, just 1 row back, but then a mother from the fundraising committee needed a place near the front, and then another parent. And so, inch by inch, June was moved further from the stage, until she was seated in the 10th row, just beneath a sagging banner that read, "Congratulations, Class of 2024. No one sat beside her. No one offered small talk. The air carried the scent of fresh mulch and expensive perfume, neither of which belonged to her. Around her, people chatted about summer homes and alumni donations, but June's eyes were fixed forward, locked on the stage. She did not blink as names were called and students began lining up in alphabetical order. She only adjusted her collar slightly when the wind picked up, revealing more of her name patch. From her seat, June could see Ethan standing near the edge of the platform, straight-backed, composed, his dark curls brushed back, his face bearing the calm expression she had taught him. Never show them they've hurt you. His robe was pressed, his shoes clean. He belonged up there. He had earned it through late-night studies at the diner counter, through early morning rides in a borrowed pickup, through rejection letters she taught him to laugh at. He didn't know she'd been moved, not yet, and June wanted to keep it that way, let him think she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Mrs. Bellamy had taken her seat now, June's original spot. She fluffed her wrap and opened a compact mirror. The usher brought her a bottle of chilled water. A photographer took a candid shot. June caught the flash from where she sat and turned away. She wasn't angry, she wasn't surprised. She was tired, but steady. Far behind the seats and the canopies, beyond the VIP tables and the donation booths, 6 men stood near the school's perimeter. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but they saw everything. One leaned in slightly, murmured to another, who gave a small nod. They were dressed in plain dress shirts, dark slacks, and shiny shoes. Their posture, however, betrayed their training. Rigid spines, broad shoulders, eyes that flicked across exits and obstacles like second nature. They stood not for the school, but for a promise, a debt owed. They had not told June they would come. They hadn't needed to. But each had received the same message months before. Ethan Maddox, June's boy, graduation. As the principal stepped to the microphone and the crowd shifted to attention, June settled back into her seat. She did not fidget. She did not glance behind her. She sat still, quiet, invisible, but immovable, because while they had taken her chair, they could not take her place. She was here, and that would be enough. His name had been Marco. He worked with machines, grease under his nails, a wrench in one hand, and a beat-up thermos of strong black coffee in the other. His laugh was too loud for quiet rooms, and he danced in kitchens without music. Marco was born just a few blocks from where June had grown up, but that didn't matter in this town. He was a second-generation Latino, son of a welder and a waitress, and no matter how clean his uniform or how steady his paycheck, he was not the kind of man girls like June were supposed to bring home. June had been 21, still figuring out whether to finish her associate's degree or move out of her parents' house. The day she met Marco, her car had stalled outside of Bailey's Auto and Tire. He fixed it in 15 minutes, refused her tip, and handed her a business card scribbled with his cell number. "In case it acts up again," he said. It did. She called, and so it began. A spark forged not in fairy tales, but under a hydraulic lift in the scent of diesel. Their first date was barbecue and a game of pool at Manny's. Their second was at the city library, where June watched him quietly help a child find a picture book in Spanish. She hadn't known then how dangerous kindness could look to some people, but she would learn. She brought him home to meet her family on a Sunday, just as the roast came out of the oven. Her father stiffened at the door, his eyes darkening at Marco's brown skin and firm handshake. Her mother smiled too much, said too little, and wouldn't make eye contact through dinner. By dessert, the silence was louder than words. They didn't say it out loud, not that day, not the next, but it hung between them, the same way the stairs did when they walked down Main Street holding hands. The comments came later. "You sure he's not just using you to get out of the garage? His kind don't usually stick around. Aren't you worried about what kind of life you're choosing?" That last one stuck. When they got married at the courthouse 6 months later, no one from her side attended. They signed the license and drove straight back to their double-wide trailer, where Marco had stocked a fridge with champagne and leftover carne asada. June laughed through tears that night. She'd chosen her life, and she'd chosen well, but she also chose isolation. They built a home out of weekends and quiet mornings. Marco worked extra shifts. June cleaned houses during the day and studied for her GED at night. When Ethan was born, they had $37 in their savings account and a freezer full of frozen waffles. But their son was healthy, with a full head of black hair and his father's wide, wondering eyes. June fell in love all over again, with her child, with her husband, with the life they were carving out inch by inch. But good things rarely lasted in their full bloom. Marco's accident happened on a Tuesday morning. The lift cable had snapped, a worn link that should have been replaced months ago. June got the call while she was changing Ethan's bed sheets. By the time she reached the hospital, it was over. Marco was gone, crushed beneath a car he had climbed under to help a young trainee who hadn't shown up for his shift. The garage denied wrongdoing, the safety reports were vague. June hired a lawyer, the case was quietly dismissed. Insufficient evidence, they said. There was no funeral crowd, no casseroles, no flowers. Some of the neighbors watched through their curtains as she carried Ethan down the porch steps that week, but no one came to the door. One woman from the post office mailed her a sympathy card with no return address. Another left an anonymous envelope with two $20 bills inside. But mostly, there was silence. It was the kind of silence that made you wonder if you'd ever been heard in the first place. She tried to move into a better school district. We're full. She applied for small business loans to fix cars from home. Need collateral. She tried to find grief groups. Spots are limited. When she enrolled Ethan in the local elementary school, she was told, very politely, that he would be placed in a class with more accommodating peers. He was 5 years old. He came home his first week asking why the other kids said he looked like someone from TV. June didn't explain, she just held him tighter. In the evenings after Ethan went to bed, June studied, not just for herself anymore, but for him. She learned to repair lawnmowers, change brake pads, replace HVAC systems. She started taking night jobs, first at gas stations, then at local shops. She kept her head down, never gave people a reason to doubt her, never gave them the chance to pity her either. But she never forgot, not the way they looked at Marco, not the way they erased him, not the way they treated Ethan like a deviation instead of a boy. It burned slow, quiet, but it never went out. And in that slow burn, she forged something steel strong. Because the town had taken Marco, had tried to take her son's seat at the table before he even sat down. But June wasn't just here to witness Ethan's graduation. She was here to prove that nothing, no whisper, no stare, no reassigned seat could stop what she had built. She had earned her place, and she would hold it. Years passed, and June built a reputation, not just as a capable mechanic, but as someone who could see patterns others missed. Her garage became a hub for the overlooked and the underpaid. She charged fair prices. She listened more than she talked. And when a man from the local VA clinic rolled in with a blown radiator and a flyer for a civil defense training program on his dashboard, he left with a fixed car and her name added to the next recruitment list. The program was funded quietly, run through a collaboration between state emergency response services and military veterans. It was meant to prepare civilians to assist in national crises, floods, riots, blackouts, urban chaos. June applied, assuming they wouldn't take her. She wasn't a veteran. She wasn't connected, but she had something more dangerous than credentials. She had clarity. They called her 2 weeks later. She arrived to the training compound just outside Fort Logan wearing her work boots and a patched jacket. Most of the other recruits were former firefighters, paramedics, or military retirees. She stuck out immediately, short, female, pale, and quiet, but she carried herself like a weight she couldn't drop, and she never complained. On the third day of orientation, they introduced the embedded SEAL trainees, 6 men, all under 30, assigned to the compound for a 2-month urban recon rotation. The idea was cross-training, military meets civilian logic. Most civilians were starstruck, not June. She nodded once and returned to her map table. They noticed her during the second week. During a simulation of an urban hostage rescue scenario, June rerouted 2 units through a side alley that wasn't even on the compound's original grid. Old building schematics, she said simply when asked how she knew. Most cities don't update them fast enough. The SEAL commanding officer raised an eyebrow. One of the recruits muttered, "Who is this chick?" He found out 30 minutes later when she spotted an ambush in the northwest quadrant before the drone feed even caught it. By the end of the 3rd week, they had a nickname for her. Guide. Not as a joke, as a title. She taught them how to read wind shifts by leaves on the sidewalk, how to predict choke points in alley layouts, how to spot weaknesses in too perfect plans. They taught her, too, in their own way, how to see movement patterns, how to clear a stairwell without getting killed. But she never pretended to be one of them. She didn't need to. Then came the heat stroke incident. The drill was simple. Simulate a rolling blackout in a mock city grid, navigate checkpoints, extract civilians. One of the younger SEALs, Deacon, collapsed just behind a loading dock. No one saw him fall, except June. She ran back alone, dragged him across the asphalt, tore off his vest, and began pouring water from her own canteen across his face and neck while shouting for medical. The instructors clocked her time. She had reached him 23 seconds before the nearest assigned medic. After that, the way they stood around her changed. No more side comments, no more half glances. They took notes when she spoke. One of them, a wiry sniper named Hartley, started showing her old satellite recon maps during lunch. "What would you do here?" he asked over and over. She told him. Every time, he nodded. Every time, he learned something. The last day of the program came too fast. No ceremony, no plaques, just a handshake and a certificate in a brown envelope. But that night, as she packed her truck, the 6 men approached her silently. Each handed her a patch, dark green canvas, marked with a number, 6. Below it, one word embroidered in dull thread, Guide. They didn't say goodbye, they just nodded and walked away. The next week, they were deployed. June never talked about it, not to Ethan, not to anyone. It wasn't a story to brag about. It was a moment that had happened and passed, but she kept that patch folded inside her glove box for years. It reminded her that even if the world only ever saw a small woman in dusty boots, somewhere out there were 6 men who remembered the difference she made. And on the morning of Ethan's graduation, when she pulled that jacket off its hanger, she paused for a moment, opened the glove box, took the patch, and sewed it, quietly, carefully, onto the inside lining, just over her heart. June had made it through the gates. She had her pass, and she had arrived early, wearing her old uniform jacket, the same one that had seen more dust and disaster zones than the polished boots lining this stage. She found her seat in the 4th row, her name neatly printed on a placard, June Maddox, parent of valedictorian. She sat with both feet planted squarely, her hands folded over the program in her lap, and her back straight despite the heat beginning to settle into the open-air venue. Her eyes scanned the stage once, memorizing the path her son would walk, and then settled in. The first 30 minutes passed quietly. The parents began filling in. There were murmurs of excitement, the occasional laugh, a few harried staff members darting between sections with clipboards. Then came the entourage, Mrs. Bellamy and her court of perfectly coiffed socialites. She walked like she was stepping onto a runway, her coral silk shawl fluttering dramatically, designer heels clicking across the pavement. Her teenage daughter trailed behind her, pout in place, irritated with the brightness or the attention, likely both. When Bellamy reached the front rows, her eyes immediately caught June's khaki silhouette among the pastels and pearls. She paused, adjusted her sunglasses, and tilted her head. Then she leaned in to whisper something to the woman next to her, who responded with a polite gasp and an arched eyebrow. June noticed. Of course she noticed. She had learned long ago how to read conversations without hearing the words. And this one was clear. What is she doing here? It was always that question. Not who is she, not what has she done, but why is she not in her place? A few moments later, a neatly dressed usher appeared at her elbow. "Ma'am, I'm terribly sorry, but we've had a last-minute change in seating arrangements. We're asking a few parents to relocate to the overflow section, just for capacity reasons." He smiled apologetically, eyes flicking to Bellamy behind her. "We'll make sure you have a good view." June stared at him for a moment. Her hands didn't move. Her jaw stayed relaxed. "This seat has my name on it," she said simply. "I understand," the usher said, his voice still courteous but firmer. "We've been advised by administration." There it was. The unspoken hand of the principal. The hierarchy of appearance, cloaked in logistics. June stood. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply gathered her things, just a folded program in her pride, and moved. They led her back 1 row. Then 2. Another parent arrived with an embellished lanyard and a glossy invitation. June was moved again. It kept happening. Quietly, efficiently, until she found herself in the 10th row, just under the canopy's edge, with sunlight bleeding onto her knees and the breeze stirring loose dirt along the floor. From her new seat she could still see the stage, still see the podium where her son would speak, but the gap between them had grown, not in feet, but in principle. Behind her, conversations flowed. Vacation plans, college gossip, a woman with a sharp laugh discussed her upcoming real estate deal. No one acknowledged June. No one offered a smile or a word of solidarity. She may as well have been a statue. But June didn't fidget. She didn't look back. She simply stared ahead, watching as the faculty filtered in and began organizing the rows of graduates behind the stage. Her eyes found Ethan quickly. He looked steady, serious, his robe ironed, tassel fixed neatly. He scanned the crowd briefly, and she held her breath, willing him not to notice she'd been moved. If he saw her pushed to the back, it would hurt, and she didn't want him to carry that today. Meanwhile, no one noticed the 6 men who had been standing at the edge of the field since the crowd first gathered. They blended in, not just because of the way they dressed, but because of the way they held themselves, purposefully, quietly, like men who knew how to wait. They didn't carry signs, didn't wear uniforms, but something about the way they moved, their alert posture, the way they scanned the perimeter, marked them as different. They had shown up without announcement, without fanfare. No one had invited them, no one needed to. They were already watching when June was escorted back. They saw each shift in her position, each polite smile that pushed her further into obscurity. They said nothing, but each time she was moved, their stance grew stiller, tighter. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jaw and graying temples, finally murmured to another. "She hasn't said a word." The other man nodded. "She wouldn't." Back in her seat, June let out a quiet breath. Her hands rested on her lap, one thumb gently stroking the edge of the embroidered patch sewn just beneath her jacket's inside lining. She didn't need to touch it to remember it was there, but she did anyway. She hadn't seen the 6 men in years, hadn't spoken to them since the training compound, but that had never mattered. Bonds forged in heat didn't require reminders. They required readiness, and somewhere, deep in her bones, she knew they were already here. The ceremony had begun to unfold like every other, predictable, polished, and carefully timed to reflect the values of a town still clinging to its own sense of order. The choir sang, the principal welcomed, the student body president made a joke about exams, parents clapped, laughed in the right places, wiped away sentimental tears when prompted. June sat unmoving in her seat, hands folded, her gaze fixed on the stage, where the lineup of graduates awaited their cue. From this distance, Ethan looked older somehow, taller than she remembered just that morning, jaw set like he was already standing in a boardroom. Then the names began. One by one, they echoed from the speakers, accompanied by bursts of applause and camera flashes. The families leaned forward, eager to catch a glimpse, to wave frantically as their child crossed the platform. June didn't move. She had no camera, no sign, just her steady breath, measured like she had trained it to be back when training had saved lives. A few rows ahead, Mrs. Bellamy had already received her moment. Her daughter floated across the stage like a swan in silk. There was applause, a kiss blown to the crowd, and the family snapped picture after picture, as if trying to trap pride inside a frame. Bellamy glanced back once, smug and satisfied. Her gaze didn't linger long on June. It never did. The crowd murmured and shifted as the ceremony reached its peak. Then came a pause, a slight glitch in the rhythm. Not enough to alarm, but enough to make heads tilt. Somewhere near the edge of the open-air assembly, the sound of shoes on gravel could be heard. Measured steps, rhythmic, intentional. From the west edge of the venue, a single figure emerged. Tall, lean, dressed in a dark suit and tie. He walked with a purpose that seemed incongruous to the ceremony, eyes forward, unflinching. Behind him another, then another, until 6 men were moving in lockstep down the central aisle. Not rushed, not loud, but undeniably present. The aisle parted around them like water. June noticed first. Her heart did not leap. It settled, a deep exhale that seemed to rise from years buried beneath effort and silence. The crowd turned, people shifted, unsure whether to stare or pretend not to. The principal leaned over to a coordinator, confusion etched into his features. "Do you know them?" he whispered. She shook her head. No one did. The 6 men reached the base of the stage and stopped. They didn't look at the principal. They didn't seek approval. One stepped forward, reaching into his inner jacket pocket and pulling out a small embroidered cloth. He handed it to the nearest usher, a patch identical to the one sewn into June's jacket. Green canvas, unit insignia, the number 6, one word, guide. Then the man turned to face the audience, his voice clear and steady. "We came to honor the woman who taught us to think when fear said run. who didn't wear rank but earned command, who saved one of us in heat stroke and saved all of us in silence. He gestured to the 10th row, where June sat motionless, her eyes glistening. That woman, right there. A hush fell. No one moved, not even the graduates. The man continued, his tone never rising. We call her guide. Today, you call her mother, of the valedictorian. Either way, no one in this place deserves a front row more than her. The words didn't echo. They settled. Heavy and unmoving. Ethan stood behind the podium, frozen, but only for a moment. Then he stepped down, just 2 small steps, and began walking toward the men. When he reached them, he extended his hand and they saluted, all 6, crisp and unified. The audience remained silent. Even Bellamy, still half turned in her seat, seemed unsure whether to stand or disappear. The silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Then someone, maybe a student, maybe a teacher, stood up and began clapping. The sound broke the stillness like a match across stone. 1 clap, then a few more, then a wave. Within seconds, the crowd erupted. Applause rolled across the lawn like thunder. People stood, not because they were told to, but because something inside them demanded they rise. June stayed seated, her eyes locked on Ethan. Her hand touched her jacket, her back straightened, not in pride, but in completion. What needed to be said had been said, and this time, she didn't have to say it. The principal tried to regain control of the microphone. His voice, normally poised and well-rehearsed, cracked slightly as he stumbled through the remaining announcements. His hands trembled just enough to betray him. He read off names with robotic inflection. His gaze never drifted toward the back row again. Mrs. Bellamy didn't speak for the rest of the ceremony. Her daughter crossed her arms, embarrassed by the shift in tone and attention. The spotlight had changed course, and for once, it wasn't something she could buy back. The seals didn't move. They remained in their quiet formation until the final name was read, until the final cap flew into the air. Then, and only then, did they slowly turn and make their way to the side, disappearing behind the shade of a nearby oak tree. No press, no statement, no need. They hadn't come for the crowd. They had come for her. And in the silence that followed the last cheer, when students swarmed together for photos and parents ran toward their children with flowers and balloons, June remained still, anchored to her seat like the last true point on a shifting compass. A few teachers passed by, offering tight smiles or hesitant nods. One stopped, leaned down, and whispered, "Thank you for more than today." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. What echoed in June's mind wasn't the applause or the recognition. It was the way Ethan had walked past the entire graduate section without hesitation, the way the 6 men had spoken with reverence, not favor, and most of all, the way no one, not even those who had tried hardest, could undo what had just been witnessed. There are moments that change the narrative, not through volume but through undeniable presence. This was hers. The applause that followed the seal's silent tribute could have ended the ceremony. It should have. It felt final, like punctuation. But there was still one name left to be called, and, as the principal's voice, now softer and less certain, announced, "Valedictorian, Ethan Maddox," the crowd leaned forward again, but this time not out of habit, out of something closer to reverence. Ethan walked across the stage slowly, his steps deliberate, his gaze locked not on the principal, not on the crowd, but on the 10th row where his mother still sat. The diploma placed in his hand felt lighter than it should have, lighter than the weight that had rested on his chest all morning. He turned toward the podium, and the hush returned. He stood silently for a moment, allowing the stillness to stretch. He didn't look at his speech. The folded pages remained untouched at the base of the podium. Instead, he placed both hands on the wood, took a breath, and looked out over the sea of faces. Parents, students, teachers, and those 6 men now standing in formation at the rear edge of the seating. "I had prepared a speech," Ethan began, voice calm but clear. "A pretty good one. It had jokes, quotes, a story about my math teacher's cat." A faint chuckle passed through the crowd, uncertain but genuine. "But I won't be reading it today." He paused, and all eyes held on him. "Because what I was going to say doesn't matter as much as what needs to be said right now." He nodded slightly toward the back rows. "With my mother." "My mother?" has been pushed aside, ignored, and overlooked by this town for as long as I've been alive. Some of you may not even know her name, but you should. Because everything I've achieved, every late-night study session, every paper, every competition, I did it with her hand steadying mine from behind the curtain. And today, she wasn't even allowed to keep her seat. A few heads dropped. Some shifted uncomfortably. Bellamy was stone still, her smile now a brittle, fragile thing threatening to crack. Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. You talk about values here, respect, service, excellence. But those aren't words you hang in a hallway. They're things you live. And no one has lived them better than the woman who taught emergency field tactics to special forces without ever firing a gun, who raised me alone while working nights, who never asked for recognition but gave everything. He gestured toward the men in the back, the SEALs now standing like sentinels beneath the flag. Those men didn't show up today for politics or attention. They came because they remember what this town has tried to forget. They came because someone you chose to ignore saved them. The silence that followed was deeper than the applause had been. It pressed on every chest, settled over every shoulder. Ethan leaned closer to the mic, lowering his voice just slightly. Her name is June Maddox. And if this school values anything it claims, then it will remember her name, the same way it remembers its founding donors or its championship banners, because people like her don't pass through, they build foundations. Quietly, he stepped back. There was no need for a closing joke, no clever wrap-up. The truth didn't require embellishment. As he turned to leave the podium, the audience stood again, not with the confusion of before, but with clarity. This was not just applause. It was acknowledgement. The principal, now red-faced, clapped dutifully, but his eyes never quite met June's. Bellamy whispered something to her husband, who remained frozen, hands clasped. A few teachers wiped at their eyes. And somewhere in the middle of it all, June breathed out, the breath she'd been holding since Ethan was born. When Ethan made his way down the steps, he didn't rejoin the graduates. He walked past them, past the stage, straight to his mother. He bent low, kissed her cheek, and whispered just 3 words. We made it. She didn't cry, not then, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to adjust his collar. They sat together through the rest of the ceremony, through the reading of scholarships and closing statements, through the final blessing and the rise of cameras as caps were flung skyward. They sat like a mountain and its shadow, silent, unshaken, bound by something deeper than pride. And when it was all over, and the crowds began to disperse and the camera flashes dimmed, they stood. The SEALs approached, one by one, and each of them shook Ethan's hand. But when they reached June, they didn't offer handshakes. They saluted. The crowd had mostly moved on by then, taking photos, collecting flowers, and claiming post-ceremony dinners at overpriced restaurants. But those who stayed behind saw something more than tradition. They saw a line of warriors, shaped not by combat alone, but by the wisdom of a woman this town had nearly erased. One of the men spoke, his voice soft but edged in respect. Ma'am, there are things that can't be measured in medals. You taught us half our playbook. Another added, and the other half we learned just by watching how you carry weight. June looked at them each in turn, her eyes steady. I didn't do anything you wouldn't have done, she said. I just didn't let anyone tell me I couldn't. Hartley, the sniper from her training days, stepped forward and placed something in her hand. It was the same patch she had sewn inside her jacket, except this one had a new line added in gold thread. Below the word guide, it now read, Honorary Command. She looked at it for a long moment, thumb tracing the edge, and then nodded. She didn't need applause. She never had. But she accepted the gesture for what it was. Not ceremony, not pity, just truth, finally acknowledged in the open. And somewhere behind them, a teacher who had once turned away from her in the hallway now stood silently, holding her phone at her side. She didn't film, she didn't intrude, she just watched. And maybe, just maybe, she started to understand. June walked away, not as a guest of the ceremony, but as its center. Not with fanfare, with gravity. The sun had begun its descent by the time June and Ethan reached the edge of the crowd. Most families were already heading to cars, waving for taxis, or bustling toward group photos near the front of the school. The buzz of celebration hovered in the air, but around June, there was a pocket of quiet, like the eye of a storm. A few strangers lingered nearby, not to gawk, not to intrude, but as if unsure whether they had just witnessed something sacred. One elderly man, an army vet judging by the pins on his cap, approached with tears in his eyes and simply said, "Ma'am, you've done this country proud." He didn't stay long enough for her to respond. Ethan stood beside her, unsure what to say. The weight of the moment hadn't fully landed yet, but something had shifted. The applause had ended, the ceremony was over, but something larger had cracked open and didn't want to close. They walked together toward the parking lot in silence, and for the first time in years, June let herself relax her shoulders. "Do you think they'll remember today?" Ethan asked as they reached her truck. June opened the passenger door for him, glanced back toward the field and said, "They'll try not to." "But it's too late. It happened." They didn't go to a celebratory dinner. No reservations had been made. Instead, they picked up burgers from the only diner still open late, drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let the night breeze in, and ate in the driveway under the faint hum of porch light. Ethan laid his diploma across the dashboard like it was too delicate to fold away. June didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her silence was full. Later that week, a photo from the graduation surfaced in the local paper. It showed Ethan at the podium, with June seated clearly in the background, flanked by the SEALs. The caption didn't name her, but the article did, and for the first time in print, someone called her the woman in the jacket. Within days, teachers and students began sharing the speech. Ethan's words spread quietly, first through inboxes, then newsletters, then folded printouts pinned to classroom boards. A teacher laminated one and left it in the library beneath a portrait of the school founders. It wasn't authorized, but no one took it down. Principal Kent announced his early retirement by the end of summer. He cited personal goals. Bellamy, too, disappeared from the parent leadership board, her absence unmentioned but felt. The vacuum they left behind wasn't filled with resentment. It was filled with re-evaluation, small changes, subtle shifts. At the first PTA meeting of the fall, someone suggested adding a new award, the Maddox Recognition for Unseen Service. It passed unanimously. June never attended those meetings. She didn't need to. She had already done her part. Back at the house, she returned to her routines, fixing cars, tuning engines, helping neighbors without advertising. A boy who lived down the block, barely old enough to drive, brought his junked sedan to her twice a week. She showed him how to rebuild a transmission using only salvaged parts. "You're teaching me how to survive," he said one afternoon. June smiled, handed him a wrench and said, "No, I'm teaching you how to not ask permission." The patch with the golden thread, honorary command, stayed in her top drawer. She never wore it, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be seen, to be real. Like her impact, like her presence, like the quiet legacy she had left behind, stitched into people's minds whether they liked it or not. Ethan started a blog, just small reflections at first, about school, service, small-town myths, and what it means to grow up watching someone invisible shape entire lives. The blog picked up traction. Readers from other states began leaving comments. One woman wrote, "My mother raised me the same way. This story reminded me she wasn't weak, just quiet." Another said, "I was that kid in the back row. Thank you for showing what it means to rise with grace." When the school board asked Ethan to speak again at the next year's graduation, he declined. He told them to let another student have the spotlight. "My mom's part is done," he said. "It's time for someone else to speak up." And yet, the seat remained. In the front row of every ceremony afterward, a single chair was left open. No plaque, no dedication, just a chair, padded, plain, facing the stage. Some years, no one mentioned it. Some years, a student asked. When they did, a teacher would smile and say, "It's for someone who never needed an invitation to belong." At the end of that first summer, June and Ethan stood outside their small garage while the sun dipped behind the tree line. The world had returned to its rhythm, but they hadn't. They'd been changed. Not by applause, but by the truth being seen, even just once. Ethan turned to her and asked, "Do you think people really change?" June didn't answer right away. She rubbed the oil from her fingers with an old towel, looked out toward the quiet road, and said, "Some don't. But the ones who matter? Yeah, they do." And as the crickets began to sing, and the porch light buzzed back to life, and the wind stirred the jacket hanging by the door, the world around her whispered something she had never expected to hear.
Thanks for riding the emotional roller coaster with QA Stories. Buckle up, The next one's even twistier.